Good evening and welcome to the U.S. Lacrosse MedStar Health Lacrosse Sports Medicine Webcast. Tonight, concussions and head protection in our game. I'm Dr. Richard Henton, Medical Director of MedStar Sports Medicine and Executive Member of the U.S. Lacrosse Sports Science and Safety Committee. Head injuries are a priority issue for men's, women's, and youth lacrosse. Standardized coaching, officiating, and sportsmanship will play an integral role in decreasing the risk and impact of this injury in our game. Tonight, with the help of our expert panel, you will be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of concussion, understand your treatment options, and appreciate cutting-edge changes in diagnoses and injury prevention. We would love to have you call in from the home audience as well as our live audience tonight. We can be reached on Facebook or Twitter at #AskMedstar. So on to our great panelists tonight. First, Dr. Carrie Kinchey, who is the team physician for Towson University Lacrosse and is coordinating this weekend's medical care for the NCAA Women's Championship here in Baltimore. Next, Ruben Ikemendia, who in addition to his work at U.S. Lacrosse, also coordinates the concussion programs for the National Hockey League, Major League Soccer, and Penn State University. Beside him, Dr. Andrew Tucker, who is the director of the MedStar Sports Medicine Orthopedic Research Center and is recognized as one of the leaders in lacrosse injury epidemiology in the country. And finally, Ann Kit Carpinetti, who in her role as Operations Director and Vice President at U.S. Lacrosse is intimately involved in rules, equipment, and administrative changes that have to do with health and safety in the game, and particularly concussion and head protection. So I'd like to thank each of you for being with us tonight. So Carrie, let's get started with you. Seems to be it's not your granddaddy's concussion or your dad's concussion. What is the current definition for the audience as far as what you as a primary care doctor view as a concussion?
Well, concussions are a challenge in a lot of ways, and when I'm talking with an athlete or their family, I will typically say a concussion for me is a group of symptoms that come after a direct hit to the head or to the body that transmits forces up to the head. And concussion can be a really tricky thing to try and recognize because it's an injury that isn't always seen. It doesn't have blood on the jersey, it doesn't have a joint that has swelling. It can be something that is invisible in a lot of ways to outward signs. So when I'm talking with them, I'm thinking about breaking down the symptoms into 4 categories. And I break it down into physical symptoms, so symptoms like headache or dizziness or light sensitivity, sound sensitivity. We're also thinking about cognitive issues or thinking difficulties. So the athlete will typically say, I feel like I'm in a fog, or I feel like I'm underwater, concentration issues, remembering troubles. We'll also think about some emotional issues. So they may be more emotional than they were in the past, more anxiety, more depression. And one of the key ones that a lot of times we'll forget about is sleep. So they'll have trouble sleeping, falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, or sleeping more than normal. And the vast majority of these symptoms are symptoms that are short-lived or symptoms that will resolve in 7 to 10 days. But for some athletes, it lasts longer.
As far as that, already I think this reflects the interest in this topic. We already have questions coming in from the home audience. So right along that line, the headaches, are they always short-term, or can concussion result in long-term headaches?
It's an individualized injury, and so for some people it's 2 or 3 days of headaches. For other people it's months, and it's really how that individual manifests the injury.
And key that the athlete doesn't go back before all these symptoms are resolved.
That is the key. What we really want to do is protect the athlete from a second injury before the first one is healed.
Tell us a little bit about the concept of treatment. It seems to be relative rest during a recovery period, sort of mental and physical.
We think the brain needs a lot of energy to heal, and so in order to do that, we want to focus all of the energy on healing. That means keeping them out of activities where they're doing a lot of studying, concentrating, reading, or things where they're active, using energy to move around or to play. And we call it aggressive rest, which is really a misnomer. They're resting. But it's an important thing to make sure that the brain has what it needs to heal.
Great. Well, Ruben, as a neuropsychologist at the highest levels, dealing with professional athletes, but all the way down to recreational athletes as well, I think the audience is familiar with this concept of neuropsychometric or neuropsych testing. Give us a little overview of the role of that formal objective testing in both diagnosing concussion and also helping the clinician know when an athlete can return to play.
One of the key things that we know about concussions, as was just mentioned, is that there can be lots of problems with thinking abilities, problems with attention, with learning, with concentration, with memory, even just focusing your attention on short tasks can be really problematic. One of the things that neuropsychological tests allow us to do is to measure those functions, to be able to see how well the individual is able to engage in those functions, how much information they can pull out as a result of those functions, and the extent to which there's any kind of deficit in those areas. And by knowing that information, we can help in the decision-making process for return to play, because these are issues that are often not readily seen, and we have objective measures to be able to do that.
How do you find, and again, the two of you are beside each other here for a reason as far as clinical care and sort of objective testing. How do you feel like the clinical symptoms correlate with the test findings? And are they usually on the same path, or sometimes do they diverge from each other?
In many ways, they are on the same path, but we find that about 30% of the time, a player will say that they have no more symptoms, that they feel fine, but yet we find that in objective testing, their cognitive abilities have not returned to where they should be. And that's particularly true of youth athletes. So that's where that testing can be beneficial, because the athlete feels fine, that they're feeling okay, but their cognitive testing is not back to where it should be. There's also about 11% of the time when the reverse is true, and that is that the cognitive testing shows that there are no significant problems, but yet there are physical symptoms or other symptoms that are still being described.
So Carrie, for return to play, do you feel like the athlete has to be back to baseline or normal testing function within neuropsych testing, as well as clinically asymptomatic before they go back?
Ideally, that's how most of our protocols work. We really like to make sure that those subtle changes that are maybe still lingering in some of the neuropsych testing are listened to and valued. So we'll look for that to be back to baseline before we start our progression of activities.
Okay. And before we move over to Dr. Lincoln and some injury epidemiology, again, a question from home already. Do you all feel like there is this concept of a at-risk or predisposed athlete? The lacrosse player that has a history of 1, 2, 3 concussions. Are there people that are predisposed or at risk more than other athletes for concussion?
I don't think we know the answer to that. I think that if you've had multiple concussions, it's more likely that you will have another concussion later, but I don't think we know the answer about predisposition.
Ruben, does the testing give us any inclination about people that might be at higher risk than others? Or could testing be used as a screening tool to define high-risk populations?
What the testing will allow you to do is look at those individuals who may have lower cognitive functioning to begin with, so that if they get injured, there's less reserve as they move forward. But there's nothing that I know of in testing that would allow us to predict who is at greater risk for another concussion. Okay. We do know that if you've had one concussion, there's a higher likelihood that you will have another, but as Carrie said, we don't understand why that is the case.
Great. Andy, we're going to move on to you next. We hear a lot in lacrosse, one sport, 2 games. And the concept that men's and women's lacrosse are played with different rules and require different equipment. You've done a lot of great research sort of showing that the mechanisms of head injuries in the men's and women's game are somewhat different. Can you share some of those results with our audience?
Sure. We've looked specifically at high school lacrosse players, and we've identified very different mechanisms representing the different styles of play and nature of play. Virtually all of the concussions going on in the boys' high school game is the result of direct player-to-player contact, almost entirely intentional checking going on. And so based on that, we suggested a change in the rules to take out that intentional use of the head or contact to the head as part of the game. With the girls' game, years ago it used to be thought that it would not be possible to actually have a concussion based on stick-to-head contact because there simply was not enough mass involved with a light plastic stick to result in concussion. But our results actually find that not only is it possible, actually about half of the time, the mechanism of concussion in the girls' game is from stick-to-head contact. So it's unintentional, it's incidental, and these aren't necessarily wild and full swings that are going on. Nonetheless, that's the situation that we're dealing with, and so we bring that to the rule makers and look at ways to intervene.
One thing a question I get a lot from parents, and we'd all love to take care of lacrosse athletes all the time, but we're also taking care of other sports. Relatively, as far as concussion or head injury, how safe is lacrosse, men's lacrosse, say, compared to football, or women's lacrosse compared to soccer?
Actually, less hazardous. So the risk is lower in the boys' lacrosse, say, to football. The odds are about 60% of what it is in the game of football, and compared to in the women's game, compared to soccer, which has essentially the highest rate of concussion, the girls are again about 60-70% the same risk as the soccer players. So it's still relatively high, but not quite as high as some of these other sports.
Well, Ann, you're in the position really where the rubber meets the road here. U.S. Lacrosse has been wonderfully proactive in health and safety for the game of lacrosse. The Sports Safety and Science Committee being almost 15 years old and one of the priorities of the organization. So you and your organization get to take the wonderful stuff that these people do and apply it to the game. So could you share with the audience some of the recent rules changes and equipment changes in men's and women's lacrosse aimed at decreasing concussion and head injury?
I can, Richard, and I think we have focused on rule and equipment interventions as we get more research and information from the experts in health and safety, but we also have focused on evolving our education and training programs for coaches and officials. For us, it certainly isn't a single intervention approach to addressing player safety. We, of course, as a governing body, have the ability to influence rules, and we do so with respect to increasing penalties associated with dangerous play. We do so with respect to trying to take certain types of hits out of the game. We recognize that what may work for the men's game may not work for the women's game. And with respect to equipment, it's not just a focus on protective equipment. Most recently, we made some advances in getting greater adherence to using a Noxie ball for both men and women's from the NCAA all the way down to youth on men and women's side, because the ball, while it's not a piece of protective equipment, it has the capability to affect injury outcomes. And so we've taken a leadership role with respect to rules, with respect to equipment, protective equipment, with respect to women's lacrosse where there isn't a helmet requirement, and that's because women's lacrosse is not a contact or collision sport like men's lacrosse, but we are pursuing an optional women's lacrosse headgear standard. We're leading efforts to do that, to provide an option for those athletes who want additional protection to address the injuries that we're learning about from Andy and his research, primarily stick to head.
Great. Well, look, a number of clinical questions rolling in again from the home audience. So a couple of questions here as far as is seeing stars or is a loss of consciousness needed to say you've had a concussion?
It's not, and we want to be very clear about that you do not need to lose consciousness to have a concussion.
The vast majority, just to add, the vast majority of concussions do not result from loss of consciousness.
Right. And the neuropsych testing, there are a lot of different packages out there. There are a lot of people, I think, in the community promoting themselves as being testers or abilities. If you were to advise the live audience and audience at home, a parent that wanted to get testing done on their kids, walk them through that a little bit.
Most parents and most people have heard a lot about baseline testing and the importance of baseline testing. And while baseline testing can be useful, and it could be a good tool that we have, it's not the end-all and be-all by any stretch of the imagination. It's important that baseline testing and post-injury evaluation is part of a complete program of concussion recognition, evaluation, and management. The neuropsych testing plays one component of that. I often hear from people, well, we do baseline testing, so that means we have a concussion program. Well, no, it doesn't mean that you have a concussion program. It means that you do baseline testing. You also need to then focus on what happens post-injury and making sure that the evaluation that occurs post-injury is appropriate and that the people who are interpreting the test data are experts in the area of being able to do that.
Great. Andy, I know you've looked at some injury epidemiology in youth lacrosse, and U.S. Lacrosse, again, has been proactive in developing youth-specific rules. Tell us a little bit about some of those rule changes in the youth game, and Andy, what may be unique about the mechanism of head injury in the youth game versus adults?
Well, some of that may depend on which rules are being played. That is, at this point, I think there are youth rules which are available, and those are encouraged because they limit checking at the younger ages of play in the boys' game. We have seen concussions in some of our youth with our boys studies, so at the U15 and U13 levels. And we think that a lot of that may be related to, again, the rules and the allowance of checking associated with that. We're not sure. We haven't been able to get video from that to explore whether or not that results from a stick-to-head or body-to-body contact.
And you mentioned earlier this concept of game-specific head protection. As the game grows and moves into other areas of the country that don't have a history of lacrosse, a common question is, well, why don't you just put the girls in men's helmets and let them play lacrosse? Tell us a little bit about the organization's approach to that and educating the public that just may not be quite as have the history of lacrosse that we may have here on the East Coast.
Absolutely. I mean, and concussion is a big issue and a big concern for all sports, not just lacrosse, but it is a challenge that it's the sport with the same name and there's very different rules. And as we're learning, again, very different types of injuries caused by different pieces of equipment. And so for women's lacrosse, yes, helmets have never been a part of the game. Part of the reason why is because helmets were developed for men's lacrosse to address skull fractures, catastrophic head injuries, injuries that we have not seen in women's lacrosse. And so what we're learning a lot more about the types of injuries that we're seeing in women's lacrosse, we believe that there may be something appropriate but unique for the kind of injuries we're seeing in women's lacrosse. And that what we're concerned about, what we're seeing out there on the field today is that athletes are wearing products that were developed for taekwondo or for rugby, or and there are associated claims that those products can help protect them in ways that haven't been substantiated by a standard. And so for us, we're not concerned that we're going to have the types of collisions that we're seeing in men's lacrosse because it's just not part of the game. It's not allowed. But the glancing blows that a player receives from a stick or the potential for a ball impact, if a soft piece of soft headgear that someone wants to wear and doesn't cause any injury to anyone else is introduced onto the field, and it can demonstrate that it has protective benefit, that it's not just there so people feel a sense of invincibility, then we believe that option should be available to them. And I think in different areas of the country when they're not familiar with lacrosse, much less women's lacrosse, really one of the most important things I always like to leave people with is this notion that it's really not the same. It's not the same game. It's a stickball sport, but again, the primary mechanism of this type of injuries in men's lacrosse is body-to-body contact, and that's what's causing those concussions. In women's lacrosse, it's stick to head. So. Apples and oranges, I would say.
Great. We're very fortunate tonight in having a number of members of the Baltimore lacrosse community, as well as athletic trainers and physicians that take care of our lacrosse athletes. And I want to go to the audience and see if there are any questions concerning head injury, concussion, or head protection for our panelists.
I have a question. We spoke a lot about return to play in terms of concussions, and one thing I know you mentioned was talk about active rest and aggressive rest in recovery. We also have to remember we're dealing with students, whether they're high school, collegiate. Can you speak a little bit to how to minimize the impact of concussion in the classroom?
Absolutely. I think whenever we see anybody that has symptoms from a concussion, we know that it disrupts their life in a lot of ways. It disrupts it in terms of home life, friends, family, school, and of course on the athletic field. Both of my parents are teachers, so they would have a fit with me if I didn't talk about the importance of making sure that while we make modifications on the playing field, we also are very focused on what we do in terms of the academic environment. So reading, concentration, bright lights, lots of people around you in class are all things that we will modify and think about. And we've been very lucky in the area to have learning coordinators and schools that are willing to work with us on some of those modifications. Those are equally, if not more important to our athletes in terms of their overall healing process.
Ruben?
Oh, I agree. I think it's really important to be able to, just as we have procedures for return to play on the athletic field, that we have them for academics as well. And it may require 1 or 2 days of not going to school initially when you're highly symptomatic, and then gradually fading in to school, reducing computer work, reducing the amount of homework that someone has, reducing then what they have to make up afterwards. Often students are very much concerned about the fact that now they keep falling behind, and how are they going to make this all up? So working with the school districts in order to actually excuse some of the work so that then they don't pile on afterwards. It's a very important issue.
And coming in from home, a question about, I think U.S. Lacrosse really prioritizes standardized officiating and coaching techniques to be a great impact on health and safety. A question from the home audience, how does U.S. Lacrosse interface with coaches and officials? Are there standards? Are there testing? How might someone at home define whether their coach of their kids' league is qualified as best possible with health and safety in their minds?
It's a great question. And certainly one of our challenges is making parents aware of the training opportunities that U.S. Lacrosse provides, the certification programs that are out there, most of which are free and accessible on www.uslacrosse.org, to find out, to ask your league administrator or a tournament director, do you require certified officials? When you're looking at a field that your child is playing on, just know that that game is not really supposed to be played with one official. And under any circumstances, the game is complex and it's a ball stick sport where there's a potential for injury, and so you need 2 officials, and you need them to be trained for lacrosse, for men or women's lacrosse. So to ask the administrators, ask the rec league if this is a priority for them. And as far as coaching goes, again, U.S. Lacrosse has a certification program nationally standardized. Many programs and leagues across the country require it, but many don't. And so if you're a parent and you're a volunteer and you want to help out with your child, your league may not make training available to you, but you can go to our website and get a free online course, whether you're a member or not, and you can achieve some type of base level training in how to coach men or women, boys or girls lacrosse. It's critically important. It's a key factor in terms of player safety. We can't expect for officials to consistently enforce the rules if they were trained to officiate football, and we can't expect coaches to consistently teach the rules of the game if they have never played it and never coached it before. So the training is absolutely critical.
So I think, the take-home message is be involved in your kids' sports.
Ask questions.
Don't just drop them off, but be an active consumer and participate in that lacrosse experience to have a positive one. Andy, tell us a little bit about some of the newest research. There's a lot going on, not only with injury epidemiology, but this concept of sensors and mouth guards or helmets to try to track contact in the game.
Well, it's a pretty exciting time in terms of the technology coming into play, so that there's been a lot of data that's now collected. Carrie actually was involved with some of those studies very recently, where sensors are either, say, placed in the helmets for the men's game, or there are other sensors that are not helmet-based. They actually attach, say, on a patch just behind the ear, and they can also detect head impact exposures. So by that we're talking about the amount of forces involved in a linear impact as well as the rotational forces. We think both of them are largely involved in whether or not a concussion injury actually occurs. But at this point, we are very early in that exploration. We're trying to find out How many impacts do certain players have? Does it vary by position? Does it vary by level of play? What is the cumulative effect over the course of a season, over the course of many seasons? So we're beginning to look at those data and try and understand it. We actually have a big challenge ahead of us. We have so much data. How do we model it? How do we analyze it? What are we analyzing it for? So we're, as I say, at the very forefront of that, but I think we'll be able to use that and better understand what kids' exposures are. Should there be limitations? All of these are very open questions that we're beginning to understand now.
And if I can just add on real quick to that, I think in the interim, we have to be cautious about what the consumers know. These are products that are readily available, and while they may be legal for use, much like what Ruben talked about with the baseline test, it's not in and of itself the silver bullet to keeping your player from getting a concussion. And I think, again, the value of this panel and these insights is to share with consumers that, a product like a new piece of technology may sound really great, and if it gives you more knowledge about your player being injured, great. But in and of itself, it's so new, it's so shiny. Just beware, buyer beware, and look for other resources about what else you can do to support a more comprehensive concussion management program.
Well, Carrie, as we wrap up, just a couple minutes left. Again, sort of savvy home audience here. I think it's really something people are paying attention to. A question is, are concussions related to just a single definable impact? Ooh, I got banged and I've got a ding. Or is it this cumulative sense of lower energy injuries that may be damaging the brain over the course of time?
I think that's the big question. We're not really sure, and that's what we're trying to figure out with some of these sensor studies, to get a sense of how many impacts are developing brains seeing, how many impacts are people seeing as athletes in the collegiate world. It's probably a combination of both. We just don't know yet.
Great. Well, look, I think we've seen tonight that the treatment and even the definition of concussion is continuing to evolve in the sport of lacrosse. U.S. Lacrosse and its medical partners are very active in research and program development to try to decrease the impact of concussions in our game. We would invite you and the home audience to visit both the MedStar Sports Medicine website and the U.S. Lacrosse Sports Safety and Science website for further information. And we hope that you all will join us for future webcasts on lacrosse sports medicine. And with that information, as we have discussed, to be a more active and involved member in your lacrosse community as far as health and safety. So thank you for your time tonight, and good night from Baltimore.